same degree of protection against self-incrimination as is available under the general law in the form of the privilege against self-incrimination. As a result, no one will be able to justify refusing to answer questions on the grounds that to do so would or might expose him or herself personally to a risk of prosecution. The undertaking does not apply to companies or other corporate bodies, which will therefore remain entitled to rely on the privilege against self-incrimination if they give evidence in their own right. The other matter, just to mention briefly, is a very hot topic, coronavirus. We're all very well aware of the outbreak of coronavirus and the fact that an increasing number of cases have been reported in this country. The number may rise, and although it's important not to panic, we must all take reasonable precautions to avoid spreading infection. Please therefore make use of the hand sanitizers when they become available, when you enter the building, and avoid attending the hearings if you feel at all unwell. You can, of course, follow the hearings on the live stream, and it's much better to do that than to risk spreading infection if you have any doubt about your state of health. So with those matters out of the way, I'm going to invite Mr. Millett to call the first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I now call our first witness to Module 1 of Phase 2, Mr. Andrzej Kuszell.
Yes, thank you.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuszell. Now, would you prefer to sit down?
Actually, one thing, I've forgotten my glasses.
And well, you better get them.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Apologise.
No, it's quite all right, don't worry. Just take a moment to get yourself settled. Yes, do sit down. All right?
Yep.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Kuszell, can you please give the inquiry your full name?
It's Andrzej Józef Maria Kuszell.
Now, thank you very much, first of all, for coming to the inquiry to give evidence today and in assisting us with our investigations. I'm going to be asking you questions today. If you have difficulty understanding anything I'm asking you, then please just ask me to repeat the question, and I'll put the question either again or in a different way so that you can understand it. Could you also just keep your voice up so that the transcribers can hear it and
Yep.
so that everybody in the room here can also hear it?
Yep.
Now, you've made a witness statement for the inquiry, and it's in a folder on your desk in front of you, and it'll also appear on the screen. Can I take you to it? It is at SEA 000-14271.
Yep.
And it's dated the 9th of November 2018. Just looking at the first page there in front of you, Mr. Kuszell, is that your first witness statement?
Correct.
Can I please ask you to turn to page 21? You'll be taken to that on the screen. There's a signature there above the date of the 9th of November 2018. Is that your signature?
It is.
And you've also provided, I believe, an exhibit, AJK1. If we can please have that up on the screen. That is SEA 000-14272.
Yes.
and there is also an index to the documents that you've referred to in your statement, which is IDX 0172. If we could please have that on the screen.
Yes.
And that is a document which runs over a number of pages. And just confirm with me, please, that these are, just looking at it, all the documents that you referred to in your witness statement.
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And if you need to see the rest of it, we can look at it. But it runs along in a similar way. Have you read your witness statement that I've just shown you recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm, or are you able to confirm, that the contents are true?
I can confirm that as far as I can recollect, the contents are true.
Thank you. Now, you also provided a witness statement to the Metropolitan Police in 2017. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
That is at MET 000199989. If we could please have that up on the screen.
Yes.
And it's dated it is dated the 15th. If you could look just on the screen there, you can see near the bottom of the screen, it's dated the 15th of December 2017.
Yes.
Have you read that statement recently?
Not as recently as my witness statement to the inquiry, but yes, I have read it in the last few weeks. Yes.
Thank you. And can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yeah, as far as possible. That statement was done very close to the event, the tragic event, and that was a much broader statement than my direct involvement. So it was produced based on information that I actually gleaned way after the event, speaking to colleagues and looking at various documents, because the police at the time were interested in the overall rather than just my specific narrow involvement.
And final general question, have you discussed with anybody the evidence that you are going to give today in any way?
Prior to preparing it, it was my personal witness statement which was prepared with the lawyers. Once it was submitted, then yes, I discussed it with colleagues.
How recently have you discussed that with colleagues?
Gosh, that's a difficult question to answer because, as you can imagine, preparing to attend the inquiry and reading all the various documentation that has been passed from the inquiry, which we can, well, we can't really even keep up with it. So I think I certainly didn't sit down with my colleagues to go through my witness statement and study it sort of page by page, but there may have been references by them to their witness statements and me to mine. In that sense, we would have spoken to each other, yes.
And when you say colleagues, who are you referring to?
Primarily Bruce and Neil, who have continued to work with me.
Right, Bruce Sounes and Neil Crawford. Yes.
Correct.
Yes. Now, at the outset, you've said in your statement that you didn't have day-to-day involvement with the Grenfell Tower project. That's what you said in your statement. That's correct, is it?
Yes.
And in the light of that, I'm not going to ask you any questions about the detail of the project or any technical matters overall. I'm going to look at more general matters, including, I should say, the initial brief for the Grenfell project, the selection of the team, payment issues, and other matters of that nature. Also, Mr. Kuszell, just so that you're clear, when I refer to Studio E, I mean Studio E LLP, but also SEAL from 2014 only. Am I clear about what I mean?
I am clear what you mean. Studio E Architects Limited.
No, you're going to have to learn to behave here. We've got someone, that's nothing to do with you. Everybody has... Would you leave the... If you can't sit still and listen, you'll have to leave the room.
I know, but what's the point if they can't be used in a court of law? What is the point? You know,
Right, have we got...
It's not what they did. This is not what they did with the firefighters.
Okay.
I know, but they didn't do it to the
All right, we're going to rise for 2 minutes, and those gentlemen will be asked to leave the hearing and not return. Come come on. Well, I'm sorry about that interruption, and I was slightly surprised because during the phase one hearings, I was very impressed by the way in which everyone listened to the witnesses in a respectful and dignified way, and I hope that now we've got that little outburst out of the way, we can resume the way we've done things in the past. You may hear things that you don't like to hear, and people may feel strongly about some of the evidence, but it's very important, if the inquiry is going to hear the evidence that it needs to hear in order to get to the bottom of things, that the witnesses are allowed to give their evidence, as I say, with dignity and respect from everyone. So,
Sorry, so Martin, can I also just make a point and just make it clear that
no,
these people are not bereaved survivors?
I don't know who they are.
I'm telling
Yeah.
you, they are not.
All right, well,
We've been here from day one, like you said.
I recognise most of the faces I see in front of me, and I'm very pleased to see you here every day, and I know how strongly you feel about all this. I didn't recognise those people. I may have seen them before, I don't know. But I'm sure you will understand that we cannot tolerate that sort of disruption, otherwise we shall not get the evidence we need.
Yeah, well, I'm just
Right.
making it clear that...
Yeah, no,
so Martin,
don't worry, I wasn't going to impute their motives to you.
and we don't condone these type of actions. We're here,
No,
we
no.
want to listen and we want to...
Yeah, I understand that. Yes, thank you very much. All right, well, now Mr. Kuszell is waiting. He can come back. Mr. Kuszell, I'm sorry about that interruption,
Well, I'm sorry too.
but we are ready to resume your evidence.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kuszell, first of all, I want to ask you some questions about your qualifications and your experience. You've set out your experience in paragraphs 10 to 12 of your inquiry witness statement, and you've put up a CV, which is at AJK1, page 32. If we can have that, please. That's SEA 0001422 at page 33. SEA 0001422 at page 33. And that's your CV.
Yes.
Just having a look at it, your CV doesn't, I think, set out your education. But can I ask you this? Are you a registered architect?
Yes.
Where did you train as an architect?
The Polytechnic of Central London.
And when was that, please?
It was from 68 to 74.
And you are a founding member of Studio E, which was set up, I think, in 1994. Is that right?
Correct.
And where did you work before you set up Studio E?
I worked with a company called Farmer and Duck
And where was that?
in London.
In London. And in what capacity did you work there?
I was there for 20 years and I rose through the ranks to become a director.
And in what sort of sectors were you working during your time there?
Quite varied. I worked in one of my first project with practice was the Queen Elizabeth Courthouse in Liverpool, which is a very large project. Subsequently, I worked on a defence contract, which I probably shouldn't say too much about. And then subsequently, I went into some commercial development work and finally into education work.
And do you have any, or did you, as at 2012, have any personal or professional experience of overcladding residential high-rise buildings?
No, personally, no.
Were you a member of the RIBA between 2012 and 2016?
Yes.
Now, if you look at your CV on the screen, please, it says in the first paragraph that in the second line you have a particular focus on sports/leisure design. That's right, is it?
That is correct.
And if we look down the page a little bit on the screen, if you can be scrolled down a bit, you can see under project experience, you can see the projects listed there. If you just cast an eye over those projects, Mr. Kuszell, they are all sports, leisure or education projects, aren't they?
They are.
Yes. As a registered architect, you are, is this right, required to undertake continuing professional development, or CPD?
Yes.
And how many hours or points per year, as at 2012, were you required to take?
Offhand, I can't quote. I did respond to the issue of our undertaking CPD in a letter to the inquiry to clarify how we undertook it. And that applied to all of us in different ways. So young architects would undertake it one way, senior, more experienced in another, and partners, directors in yet another way.
Are you personally, or were you personally, required to keep records of your CPD?
Strictly speaking, yes. But again, as I reported in the letter to the inquiry, not all of us were as diligent as we might have been to have maintained the records. That didn't mean that we didn't actually do the CPD.
Well, let me ask you directly. Did you keep any records of your own CPD?
Yes, by diary and note form. Yes, I did.
Right. Did Studio E have a policy of retaining annual CPD record sheets?
Yes, it did, and we kept a register of CPD talks that were held in the practice, and we also had a format for recording CPD by our staff.
Yeah. And did those were those records kept during the years 2012 to 2016?
As I mentioned earlier, they weren't kept as thoroughly as I would have liked. It was always a struggle to get everybody to complete these records.
Who oversaw the maintenance of the CPD records at Studio E LLP and after that Studio E Architects Limited?
We had office management that actually kept an eye on those and actually issued reminders to everybody to complete them.
And who did the office management, who were they responsible to?
To eventually the directors or the partners.
And that included you, did it?
And that would have included me.
I see. Do you know if those records still exist?
Some do, but not all, because the LLP folded in 2014, and therefore at that stage we lost some of the records.
Now, I want to move on to Studio E. You've said in paragraph 17 of your statement, if we could please have that up, it's SEA 000142771, page 4. If you just have a look at that, you say the core of the practice's work, it's paragraph 17.
Yes.
The core of the practice's work has rotated around education, sports and leisure, recreation and commercial work, with sensitivity towards designing buildings that were environmentally sensitive. You see that?
Yes.
Does that mean that you had a particular interest in designing greener buildings?
If you mean that we were interested in actually making a difference in the environmental impact of our buildings, yes.
Does it follow from that you and the practice, if I can use a loose expression, would have some familiarity with products designed to achieve good thermal performance?
Yes.
Now, the Grenfell Tower project had a construction budget of about £8.5 million. You remember that?
I recall that was the budget.
Yes, it doesn't matter about the exact figure for the moment. How did that compare with other projects that your practice was undertaking at the time, namely 2012 onwards?
It would be difficult to make a comparison because we were typically doing projects ranging anywhere between 15 and 30 million on a large number of schools as well as a smaller number of leisure projects. I don't think that would have given us a gauge to measure the budget for the Grenfell Tower.
Well, let me ask it slightly differently. Was the Grenfell Tower project budget at £8.5 million pounds or so, bigger or smaller or about average for the kinds of size of project that Studio E typically would undertake in 2012 onwards?
It was probably at the lower end of the... we did a wide range of projects. We were still doing small projects, which would have been a good deal smaller than Grenfell. But the larger proportion of our work was somewhere between the 15 and 30 million mark.
Thank you. Now, we know that there were two entities, Studio E Architects Limited, SEAL, and Studio E LLP. Studio E Architects Limited, that was registered in 1994, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it still exists today, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And Studio E LLP, that was founded, I think, in 2007, correct?
Yes.
And it started trading in 2011?
Correct.
Is that right? And it then entered into creditors' voluntary liquidation in 2014.
Correct.
Can you remember the month in which it did that, even roughly?
July.
July. Can you tell me what was the purpose of having these two entities side by side?
The main thrust of it was we took accountancy advice and we were looking to increase the directorship, partnership level in the practice from the 3 to a greater number. And we were advised that the LLP would be a better vehicle for doing that.
I see. So it was to extend, as it were, commercial participation to a wider number of people.
Correct.
I see. Can I ask you to look, please, at paragraph 16 of your witness statement, which is SEA 0001427 at page 4. Now, you say in paragraph 16 that SEAL is a small company, you see that, and you say that at 31st of March 2017 we employed 12 staff and our net assets were £48,803. You see that?
Yes.
But you go on to say that it had been a larger practice and employed up to 45 staff, and by way of illustration, as at the 30th of June 2008, the net assets of SEAL were £168,048.
Yep.
Why did you start trading as an LLP in 2011?
There was a lot of discussion between the directors as to when we should consider other younger members of the practice being elevated to a directorship. And we spanned quite an age group. The eldest director is 7 or 8 years older than me, and the younger director was a good 15 years younger than me. So there were different views about all of this, and it was only in 2011 that we concluded that we really ought to be doing something on this front, and we launched the LLP.
I see. And was that also for the purposes of raising capital?
No.
So you didn't ask the new participants in the LLP to put in any money? I see. And what happened to SEAL, Studio E Architects Limited, the company, in the period 2011 to 2014?
It became not entirely dormant, but its trading ran down, and the LLP effectively took all the new work.
Right. And how many registered architects were working at Studio E LLP in the period 2011 to 2014?
I would need to check our records on that. We predominantly employed fully qualified architects, and so the vast proportion would have been qualified in the UK or elsewhere, because architecture typically actually attracts employees from all over the world. So if you need the answer to that, I would need to check it.
Well, let's see if we can get to it more shortly. At paragraph 16 of your statement, which is on the screen,
Yep.
you say that Studio E had been a larger practice and employed up to 45 staff.
Correct.
During the period 2011 to 2014, were those 45 staff, or maximum 45 staff, employed by Studio E LLP.
Yes.
I see. Thank you. And when Studio E Architects Limited, the company which had been dormant, took over the Grenfell project in 2014, what was the size of the employees of that company as opposed to the LLP?
I think it was 9.
9. And were any of the Studio E LLP employees moved over
Yes.
from LLP to Limited?
In fact, I think the whole lot, all 9, were moved from LLP to Limited.
I see. Okay. How many registered architects were working at Studio E Architects Limited from 2014 to 2016?
Again, I need to check the number. They were all architects. How many of them were actually registered in the UK? I, again, would have to get back to you to verify that number.
Right. Am I correct in thinking that Studio E, in either of its forms, LLP or Limited, had never before the Grenfell Tower project undertaken a project involving overcladding a high-rise residential tower?
Sorry, did you ask any of the employees or anybody or the practice?
Well, the practice, in either of its forms.
No, it didn't.
Did Studio E, in either of its forms, have any experience of high-rise residential projects at all?
As a practice, no.
What about refurbishment of tower blocks?
Again, no.
And what about overcladding existing buildings, whether or not they were tower blocks?
Yeah, we would have had some element of that because we were involved in not only building new schools but also refurbishing old schools.
Would you agree with this general proposition, Mr. Kuszell, that those types of projects, high-rise residential projects, refurbishment of tower blocks, give rise to particular technical considerations or challenges which might differ from those which may arise when you're building a new school or a sports facility?
Yes, I would agree that it is a different set of challenges.
I'm going to turn now to questions about your familiarity with the regulatory regime, if I may.
Can I actually add a rider to the answer
of course.
from the previous thing? I'm a founder of the practice, and there was a time when every project that we did was a new project. So there was our first extension to a school, our first small sports facility, and we did all our projects to a very high standard, even though they were the first, actually receiving huge accolades and a lot of recognition. So the issue of whether a project poses new challenges is not, I think, if that is the implication that somehow we were not capable of doing the project, I think that is false because clearly every project eventually, in your experience, there comes a point when every project is a first. And we had actually been dealing with projects of quite some sophistication and complexity as firsts. So leisure centres are not at all straightforward projects, and we did them to a very, very high standard.
Can I now turn, as I was going to your familiarity with the regulatory regime? And I'm going to start with the CDM regulations. Do you understand what I mean when I refer to the CDM regulations? Yes. What did you understand, as at 2012, that Studio E's duties were under the CDM regulations?
Our duties were to design buildings in a safe manner, and buildings that would actually be safe in the way they were used.
Yeah. And as a quotes-unquote designer, it's a word used in the regulations,
yes.
You were aware, were you, that Studio E, and I think this is Studio E Limited for this purpose, owed duties to its client when preparing or modifying a design? Yes?
Yes.
And you've mentioned duties to design in a safe manner. Is there anything else you would wish to add to that?
Yes, I mean, the practice is ISO 9001 registered. It has a health and safety policy. That health and safety policy is updated as required, and every member of the practice is actually obliged to sign that they've actually read the policy and understood its contents.
Who was it within Studio E at board or partner level, as at 2012, who was tasked with ensuring compliance with health and safety duties, including CDM compliance?
Health and safety in our practice was structured. So I was actually the director in charge of health and safety coordination. That imposed a structure across the practice. So partners and senior management were designated with different roles within the health and safety process to ensure that the health and safety policy was performed.
What were those different roles? Just exploring that answer a bit more. What were those different roles?
Well, we split it into two. Health and safety that was related to the administering of our office and our staff, and health and safety that was related to project and site safety.
And who was in charge, as at 2012 through to 2016, of administering the health and safety relating to projects and site safety?
My partner at that time, Gary Stewart.
Gary Stewart, okay. And did anybody supervise Gary Stewart's oversight of that aspect of Studio E's health and safety work?
Well, I would say that the board had a responsibility to ensure that things were happening as they should.
Right. I'm going to turn to the building regulations, and I'm going to ask you first some very general questions about your own familiarity with them and the approved guidance. In 2012, when Studio E started work on Grenfell Tower, were you aware of the requirements of Schedule 1, Part B, fire safety of the Building Regulations 2010?
Yes, I would have been aware.
You would have been aware. Were you aware of Part B3, internal fire spread?
I was aware, yes.
And what about Part B4, external fire spread?
Yes.
At the outset of your work on the Grenfell Tower project, did you take any steps to familiarise yourself or re-familiarise yourself with the particular requirements of those two parts of the building regulations, Schedule 1, Part B3 and B4?
Personally, I didn't. I think, as you stated at the outset, I was not hands-on involved on the project. So at that time, I was actually involved in the Kensington Aldridge Academy in a much more direct way, as well as having various other duties in the practice. So familiarising myself against specific regulations in relation to the tower was devolved on others in my practice.
On whom?
Well, the lead was taken by my colleague Bruce Sounes.
Right. When Studio E secured the commission for Grenfell Tower in 2012, does it follow from what you've just said that you didn't actually go back and reread Schedule 1, Parts B3 and B4? You left that to Mr. Sounes?
Correct.
Right. Did you, at any time after that, look at Schedule 1, Parts B3 and B4 of the building regulations? Or
In
did you-
relation to the tower?
Yes.
No.
Did it occur to you in 2012, at the time that you got the commission for the Grenfell Tower project, that because the project involved an external wall construction on a building over 18 metres in height, there were building regulations and there was guidance that pertained to that?
Sorry, can you repeat
Yeah.
that question?
Did it occur to you, did it go through your mind, that because the project that you had won through the commission involved an external wall construction on a building exceeding 18 metres in height, there were relevant building regulations and guidance about it?
I guess it would have occurred to me, yeah.
Do you remember it occurring to you, or are you just speculating about your memory?
I'm not really speculating. I think the at the time when we got the commission, which was not, shall we say, we won a project which was for an academy and a leisure centre, as well as also a piece of residential development. And then the Grenfell Tower entered the equation. I recall that my colleague Bruce Sounes actually texted me or emailed me saying that we would need to actually do some rapid CPD on the subject of the tower because it was something which was not in our normal experience. And I think at that point I would have registered that there were issues relating to the tower, both in terms of regulations and codes that we had to familiarise ourselves with, yes.
Very well. We will come back to that.
Yeah.
As a general question, do you agree that fire safety is fundamental to the work of an architect's practice?
Yes.
And do you agree that fire risks are one of the key areas that need to be mitigated so far as reasonably practicable when you're fulfilling CDM and health and safety obligations?
Yes.
Would you also agree that any competent architect would have an awareness, at least, of existence, importance and purpose of the fire-related provisions in the building regulations and the associated approved documents?
Yes.
And as a slightly less general question, a bit more specific, when you started work on the Grenfell Tower project and making all allowances for the fact that you weren't involved in the detail, the day-to-day detail, did you appreciate that the essential objective of Schedule 1 Part B of the building regulations is to slow the spread of any uncontrolled fire and smoke and to preserve the integrity of the overall structure and compartments of a building?
You're asking me quite a technical question, and I'm hesitating to answer it because I think if I was working on the project, I would have definitely been considering the implications of what you've just said, but I wasn't working on the project.
Right. So is that a question for Mr. Sounes rather than for you?
I think
Sounds, I should
I
say.
think it should be for the people who are working on the project.
All right. Can I ask you to look at approved document B? And given your answers so far, we needn't take very long on it, but it's useful to have it up on the screen. It's CLG 00000, so 5 zeros, please, 224. CLG 5 zeros 224. And there it is, fire safety, approved document B under the Building Regulations 2010. Just looking at the first page of that document, were you familiar, at least even in general terms, with this particular version of approved document B at the outset of your involvement in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment?
Yes.
Can you remember ever having attended any courses which educated you on the guidance contained in this document, approved document B?
No, I didn't attend any courses specifically training me to apply that document. In the past, I would have been trained and how to use a document similar to this, but this specific document, I did not receive any specific training. No.
Right. As a firm or company, let me use the word practice to cover both entities. Did Studio E have any system whereby, when updates to regulations and guidance, such as approved document B, came into force, were published by the government, Studio E received them and disseminated them among its practicing staff?
The procedure we followed was that each time a new project entered the practice, it would be set up on the system and it would move into various work stages. So typically in architecture, we don't start designing the building on day one. We're very, very frequently involved in developing a brief with the client and appointing a team, either directly or on behalf of the client. And so information starts to accumulate. Typically, when it comes to fire, it's very rare for us these days to actually be working on a project without a fire consultant.
Right.
And when it comes to the fire regulations, which have, as you can see from this document, have become increasingly voluminous and actually at times difficult to interpret, it's critical to get involved with building control as early as possible. And when you're dealing with any project which has any order of complexity, then a fire consultant is essential to guide you through.
Right. So I think the answer to my question was no. My question, just to repeat it again, it was that when a document or an update to regulations and guidance, such as approved document B, comes into force, does Studio E generally receive them and then disseminate them?
No, the answer isn't no. The answer is that your familiarity with regulations is only as good as the most recent project you're doing. So every project would actually generate an upgrade of the information that was available. And so typically the information would actually go into a central file, which was accessible to all people in the practice. And of course, much of this information is also available online.
Right.
So the drill is, just to answer the question, be clear, that on every project we wouldn't assume that because we'd read the building regulations the year or 2 years or 3 years previously, that those were the regulations we were applying. We would be looking to the current regulations.
Similar question in relation to industry guidance. Were you at any stage of the Grenfell Tower project familiar yourself with industry guidance for cladding, such as, for example, and there are others, the CWCT standard?
Personally, I wasn't, no.
And would the same apply, I suppose it would, in relation to the CWCT Technical Note 73 and BCA Technical Guidance Notes?
Without looking at them, I can't comment.
All right. Now, I want to turn to the initial brief for the project and start with calc. It's right, isn't it, that Studio E won the commission for the Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre, or CALC, through a competitive procurement process?
Yes.
And that process had been, I think, is this right, advertised by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, or RBKC, through the official journal of the European Union, yes?
Yes.
Was that in 2011? Do you remember?
Yeah, yes, it was in 2011.
Do you remember when in 2011?
I think we secured the commission in September 2011, so it would have been in the earlier parts, sort of early summer, late spring, that the whole process started. I think it must have been around about May. I can't be certain.
Right. Now, do you agree, and I'm going to ask you three things and see if you agree with them. Do you agree that first, the purpose of undertaking a competitive procurement exercise includes securing best value for money?
I think you should ask the client that question.
No, but I'm asking you as an experienced architect, Mr. Kuszell, from your perspective and experience, the purpose of undertaking a competitive procurement would include securing for the client best value for money, no?
Best value.
Best value for money.
Well, you're adding money and I'm saying best value.
All right. Is there a difference?
I think so.
What is that difference?
If you believe that the architect you're appointing actually might do something which is that much better and maybe costs a little bit more.
The second purpose of an undertaking of a competitive procurement exercise is this right? Appointing an architect with the level of skills, knowledge, and experience which is appropriate for and suited to the work involved in it. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Would you also agree that the purpose of a competitive procurement exercise would be compliance with public authority obligations to conduct fair tender procedures.
You're asking me here to ask
Yes.
answer a question on behalf of the client, yes?
Well, I'm asking you from your experience again. The purpose of a competitive procurement exercise would be compliance with public authority obligations, assuming the client was a public authority, to conduct a fair tender procedure.
I would assume that they would have to respect their own procedures, yes.
All right. Now, you say, and this is paragraph 27 of your statement, if we could just have that up, actually. It's SEA 000-14271 at page 7. Thank you. Page 7, paragraph 27.
Yep.
You say there that this is the fourth line, that amongst the selection criteria, there was the requirement to have 3 academies and 3 leisure centres completed in the previous 5 years. And you go on to say, we were one of the few practices, or a few practices, who could qualify. You see that?
Yes.
How many others would you say could compete with you for that project, Calc, on your track record?
I would struggle to make a judgment on that. There would have been quite a number.
Right. But it's right, is it, that RBKC, who was the client on that, I think we can agree, were looking for a very experienced and highly specialised architectural practice to undertake the Calc project?
Yes.
Yes. And the selection process for the Calc project, was that very rigorous, so far as you knew?
As far as we understood, yes, it was
Yeah.
rigorous.
And you go on to say that, I think this is over the page 8, same paragraph. In the third line, our win was a major achievement for the practice. You see that?
Yes.
So it's right, is it, that this was a highly prized project? Calc was a highly prized project,
Yes.
so far as you were concerned? Yes. Now, at that stage, when you won the tender in 2011, the Grenfell Tower project was not part of the project you had won, was it?
No.
Would it follow from that your suitability for undertaking design work on a refurbishment of Grenfell Tower did not form part of the assessment in the Calc procurement?
No.
Now, again, just to be crystal clear about this, it was RBKC, is this right, who selected Studio E as the architect for the Calc project, not the TMO?
I couldn't be categoric on that because I wasn't party to any discussions that may have occurred between RBKC and TMO.
Fair enough. But from your perspective, as far as you understood it at the time,
Again, I can't not be categoric. I mean, the first it was mentioned to us was through RBKC.
right. Now, if you stick with paragraph 27 on page 8 of your statement where we are, you go on to say, following our appointment, we were required to procure further services, including a fire engineer. Who did you procure to act as a fire engineer on Calc?
Exova.
Did Studio E retain them, or did RBKC retain them
For
the Calc project?
they were employed to us.
When you say they were employed to you,
Yeah, they were a sub-consultant to Studio E.
I see what you mean. So Studio E entered into a contract, did they, with Exova?
Correct.
I see. Do you remember who it was at Exova who you were negotiating that contract with?
No. I mean, there'll be a record, but I cannot remember.
Okay. Did you oversee the entry by Studio E into the contract with Exova for the Calc project?
Yes, I would have been involved in their appointment.
Right. Do you know who else would have, at Studio E, would have been involved in Exova's appointment as fire engineer on the Calc project?
I would have discussed it with my team, probably Bruce Sounes and Neil Crawford, who were working closely with me at the time.
And do you remember who it was at Exova who produced reports to Studio E for the Calc project?
No, I cannot. I mean, it's so long ago, I cannot recall it. I repeat, we all have records of all this, but I cannot recall.
Do you remember who at Studio E was receiving and examining Exova reports in respect of the Calc project?
At that time, we had several senior people working on Calc, and they would have been liaising with Exova on the various measures that were being recommended for the scheme.
And are you able to tell me who those several senior people were?
Yes, I mean, Neil Crawford was one. If I remember correctly, there was an architect, Marcus Kiefer, who was working on the project at that stage.
Yeah. Anybody else?
It was quite a team. So.
All right. Now, you say in the same paragraph. Before I move on to that, can I just ask you, were you generally happy with Exova's work on the Calc project?
We'd worked with Exova and I think they were called Warrington before that.
Warrington Fire, I think.
Warrington Fire for quite a long period. They had been our consultant of choice on a series of schools.
Right. You say a consultant of choice. How far back in time did your relationship or experience?
You're really testing the memory, because we're going back into probably the sort of mid-noughties.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we may come back to that in due course. Now, can I move on in your statement? Same paragraph, just a bit lower down on the same page. Let's look together at the sixth line down. You say, in considering the implications of the proposed development, it was clear that in urban planning terms, the interface with the tower was a very important factor, particularly for Calc, which would be so close to its base. You see that?
Yes.
Did you mean, when you wrote that the appearance of the tower would have a detrimental or some other effect on the aesthetics of Calc?
I think I meant, if you permit me to, which precise part of this paragraph are you referring to?
Okay, so it's the second from last sentence, the middle of the paragraph, where you say, in considering the implications of the proposed development, you go on to say, it was clear that in urban planning terms, the interface with the tower was a very important factor, particularly for Calc, which would be so close to its base. So we're looking at that sentence, and just focusing on that sentence, did you mean there that the appearance of the tower would have perhaps a detrimental effect on the aesthetics of Calc?
No.
What did you mean?
I meant that in urban terms, there was a sensitivity between a residential tower, which already existed, and the way you configured a school close by.
And what were those implications then that you're speaking of here?
Perhaps it's best answered by describing the approach we took in our second stage of us winning the project, in terms of we had to produce a design in competition with the other five practices the other five teams. And our approach was to adopt a ribbon solution to the school, something we'd actually done very successfully on other schemes. And the reason why we adopted the ribbon solution was because we knew that we could, like a ribbon, maximize the distance between the school building and the tower, which we thought was an important thing to do in terms of the sensitivity of the relationship of the two. And so that is a good example of how we approach the contextual urban equation that was posed by the site and the tower.
Did the presence of the tower create any particular design or urban planning problems for Calc that wouldn't exist if the tower had not been there?
Yeah, there were quite a few. I mean, it was we were placing a school on a site where there had been no school. There'd been open multi-use games areas and a car park. So we were creating a new building of some significance on a site which had constraints in every direction you could look at. So the tower was one of the issues, which clearly there is the issue of overlooking potential concerns from the tower's perspective of noise generated by the school. There are issues of very complex issues of boundaries because the land ownership had got very complicated in that area. So in every boundary there were problems to be resolved by the council that affected actually our definition of what actually would become the final school site.
Right. And so would it be right to say in perhaps general or summary terms that the tower posed some limitations on what you could do with the external surroundings of the Calc scheme?
Yes, but that's not unusual in an urban context.
So would it be right to say that Grenfell Tower was viewed, so far as you knew, as a problem for Calc, which needed to be solved?
I don't think we actually ever saw it that way.
Okay. Well, how did you see it?
We saw it as a constraint of the site. We are very familiar. In fact, I would say that we have a reputation for doing difficult sites well. So, in a way, constraints generate good solutions if you actually work with the constraints.
Can you please be shown a document, TMO 1000965, page 3. TMO 1000965, page 3. Now, this is not an email that you would have seen at the time, Mr. Kuszell, so let me start, to be fair to you, by making that clear. It's an email from Jane Trethrui at HHASC Housing to Mark Anderson and others at the TMO, subject Grenfell Tower, importance high, and in the second paragraph, where is it? Yeah, if you go to page 3, would you just give me a moment? I think we may have got a slightly different document on the screen.
No, I've got, if it's the...
Yes. If you go, well, perhaps we'll come back for this document. I'll come back to it in a moment. Can I ask you to go to paragraph 33 of your statement and go to, which is on page 9. Now, you say there that at paragraph 33, on the 7th of December 2011, I was approached by Peter Wright of RBKC regarding potential works to the tower. And there's a reference there to an email. Can we have that, please? It's SEA 00003556. Now, this is an email from you to Peter Wright at RBKC, subject Grenfell meeting agenda.
Yep.
And you say there, this is 8th of December 2011, and you're referring there to a discussion yesterday. Do you see that? Peter, further to our discussion yesterday,
Yes.
and that would be the 7th of December 2011. And you say in that email, I've pulled together a meeting agenda which sets out what I think we will need to cover tomorrow.
Yep.
And if you go, please, to the agenda itself, we can show that to you. That's SEA 403557, please. SEA 00003557.
Yep.
And here it is, calc meeting to review potential works to Grenfell Tower to be held at RBKC Town Hall on Friday 9th December at 10 a.m. Agenda, do you see that?
Yes.
Just casting your eye down it, you can see a number of issues or topics for discussion on that day. Is that agenda based on your conversation that you'd had with Peter Wright?
No, at that stage we had absolutely no certainty that the tower would be a commission that would come our way. We knew that there were discussions inside Kensington about undertaking works to the tower, and Peter had approached me for a sort of early explorative meeting, and I always prefer to be prepared, even for a exploratory meeting, so that agenda was thrown together just to give it some structure.
Right, well, you say it was thrown together. Was it you who, as it were, threw it together?
Correct.
I see. So was it you, therefore, who proposed the scope of work outlined in your agenda?
It was my I cannot remember how much discussion there may have occurred prior to this, but I created a list, almost like a sort of checklist of things that might come up.
I see. If you look at item 2,
Yeah.
it says review of work scope, windows cladding. Do you
Yes.
see that?
Yes, I do.
So was it you who put those on the agenda for discussion with Mr. Wright?
I doubt whether I would have said that unless there was an indication from somebody at the council that that's what they wanted to do.
Where do you remember getting that indication from, do you think?
I attended meetings, SRO meetings, which was basically a senior executive meeting which overviewed the project, and I'm fairly confident that there would have been mention of the tower as an issue that needed to be addressed at some point.
Do you remember who first suggested cladding to you, such that it turned up on this agenda?
It could have been Peter, it could have been Laura.
Right.
I can't think of anybody else at that time I would have been speaking to who would have had any knowledge of this.
So Peter Wright or Laura Johnson,
Yes,
both at RBKC, yes?
yes.
Come back to it.
Ring soon as well.
So would it be right to say that from an early stage, late in the year 2011, you knew that overcladding of Grenfell Tower was likely to form part of any project in respect of that building?
Yes, that was the indication that was being given by Kensington.
Do you remember whether Peter Wright had mentioned cladding to you on the 7th of December during the discussion that you referred to in your email? I know it's a long time ago, but does that trigger a recollection?
If I didn't have the note and the agenda in front of me, I wouldn't remember the meeting. I'm sorry, but it's...
Okay. So I think, well, before we leave this document, the work scope also refers to, in the last bullet point under item 2, do you see, upgrade of externals,
Yes.
additional stairs stroke lift from raised deck, removal of existing disused stair, re-landscaping of deck and ground levels above areas of North Tower. Was that from you, or was that again from Peter Wright or Laura?
Well,
Johnson?
it would have been... I'll have to caveat this because obviously I'm trying to recall, but we'd been working on the Academy and Leisure project for a couple of months at this point, and we'd got fairly well into trying to analyse all the different boundary conditions and relationships with all the various adjoining properties. So from what I can recollect, there was discussion about how to improve circulation around the tower. So there were discussions afoot to provide a new lift which would actually permit pedestrians to come down from the first floor deck down to the ground level. There was a discussion about a disused stair, and then there was the issue of how the landscape might integrate with the deck level.
Now, to be blunt about it, can I ask you this? Was there a feeling in your head that the appearance of Grenfell Tower and its surroundings was something of an eyesore next to the proposed project for Calc?
You're using very subjective and strong terms, and I don't think we would have this was an upgrade of a very large swathe of that part of Kensington, because the new scheme was the academy, the leisure centre, the public realm that surrounded it. You could see why the council might be thinking that it might be a good idea to upgrade the tower.
And that's the council's thinking. You can see that. But what about your feeling? That was my question.
Well, I clearly could see that it would be a good idea to upgrade the tower if that was the appropriate time to do it.
Because of the way it looked, is what I'm suggesting to you.
I think you're trying to put words in my mouth, and I'm not prepared to say it. I don't think I had such a strong view of the tower. I repeat, we work within the constraints that we find on every given site, and if the tower had remained as it was, then it would have remained as it was. There were other motivators that actually caused the council, I think, to move on the tower.
Very well. Now, can I take you back then to a document that I had tried to show you and failed to show you a moment ago? Can you please go to TMO 1000965?
Page 3.
And can I ask you please to go to page 3?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, this is the bottom email on that page. Is the one I wanted to show you, which is the one from RBKC, from Jane Trethewey to Laura Johnson and Peter Wright on the 2nd of November. If you go, please, to the bottom of the page, third line from the bottom, it says, and if I've got a device I might be able to assist you with, which I was told was going to help. Never mind. In the last sentence, on the bottom of that page, you can see it says this: Peter advised that the Calc architects are very aware of the poor quality of the ground floor frontage. Do you see that?
Yes.
That Grenfell Tower creates for their scheme, and have been keen to make proposals as to how to improve it. Now, you were the Calc architect, Mr. Kuszell. First of all, can I ask you, did you say to Peter Wright that you were aware of the poor quality of the ground floor frontage that the Grenfell Tower creates for your scheme, and were keen to make proposals as to how to improve it? Did you say that to him?
First of all, I don't think these are my words.
No, you're right, they're not. And I should have told you this. This is an email you didn't see at the time.
No.
It's just recording a discussion within RBKC.
But the answer to your question is that we were working, as I've mentioned earlier, across a whole series of complex boundaries, which required some creative thinking about how to reconcile the new development with everything that adjoined it. And the boundary around Grenfell Tower, over and above actually some parts of it being held very dear to the people of Grenfell, was actually quite fluid. I mean, there was no physical boundary that actually defined exactly what belonged to which property. But it was clear that whatever scheme came forward, not so much as part of the academy, but part of the public realm development, needed to reconcile a lot of issues, and this was one of them.
Right. Mr. Kuszell, let's just take this a little bit more in stages. My first question is, did you, or anybody within Studio E to your knowledge, tell Peter Wright that you were aware of the poor quality of the ground floor frontage to Grenfell, that Grenfell Tower creates for the calc scheme? Did you say that?
I don't think I would have said it in exactly those words, no.
Or did you give the sense of it?
I would have given the sense of it in the sense that I've already explained to you, that when you have a site which has amorphous boundaries and often areas which had been perhaps ill-considered or neglected, that as part of the upgrade of the area, you would have considered it in that way.
And did you say or give the sense of the idea that you were keen to make proposals as to how to improve it?
I don't think we had any option but to suggest that, because the scheme included the public realm that actually directly adjoined the tower, as well as also would form the direct public realm adjoining the Academy and Leisure Centre.
Can I ask you to look on in the same email on page 4, if the operator could turn over the page? It's a long email.
Yes.
And if you look, please, at the third bullet point down, it says this: the TMO is also keen to investigate the opportunity to clad Grenfell Tower and replace its windows, and will seek to cost this out with a view to investing EPG funds here. Do you remember that? Do you remember that being something the TMO was keen to do?
Can you tell me when exactly this was written?
Yes, this was the 2nd of November 2011.
No, I wouldn't have been familiar with this correspondence at all. I mean, I repeat, my awareness of the intention to do something with the tower, I think almost entirely was based on conversations with Peter and the meetings I attended at Kensington with Laura Johnson.
Right. Can I just ask you then, taking that, noting what you've just said, look at the next sentence, next two sentences in the same bullet point. It says, this will have the advantage of addressing the investment needs of one of its worst property assets and prevent it looking like a poor cousin to the brand new facility being developed next door. There may be an option to have a cladding design that links to the design of the academy so that the visual appearance of the area is significantly improved. Now, I've shown you that. My question to you is, Mr. Kuszell, is that something, or are those things that Mr. Wright or Ms. Johnson ever discussed with you?
I think I can only speculate and try to recall, because I don't remember exactly what would have been said at the time. These are conversations which were held 9 years ago. So
don't speculate, but do try to recall.
I am trying to recall, and I do know that there were discussions about the recladding of the building. And clearly, if it was reclad, then there would be the issues of consideration of what the reclad would be and how that actually worked with the development alongside.
Yeah. I mean, did anybody ever say to you that they wanted a cladding design that linked to the design of calc so that the visual appearance of the area would be significantly improved?
I think that the motivator for recladding the building was several. I mean, I believe it was as much to do with the thermal performance of the envelope as it was to actually improving the appearance of the building within the context of the new development.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, we've been going for an hour. I know we had a
Yes.
slightly delayed start. It may be appropriate to have a break now. I'm on the same topic, but we're going to move to a different document.
Right, it would be convenient from your point of view.
Yes.
Yes. Well, Mr. Kuszell, we have a break during the morning because many people, not just the witness, find that if we run for 3 hours, it's too long. So we're going to take a break now for just over 10 minutes. I'm going to ask you, please, not, now you've started giving evidence, not to discuss your evidence or even the subject about which you're speaking to us with anyone else until you've finished. All right? And We'll rise now and we'll resume at 25 to 12, please. Thank you. Right. Could you ask Mr. Kuszell to come back, please?
Drained away the protest.
Ready to carry on, Mr. Kuszell?
Yeah.
Mr. Kuszell, a couple of questions just to go over one or two things from earlier this morning in your evidence. You refer to 9 employees or staff members at Studio E. Did that include support staff, or were they all registered architects?
There was one office manager.
One office manager, but the rest were registered architects, were they?
The rest were architects,
Architects.
or nigh on architects. I mean, fundamentally, the practice, the people who were with us were, I think, bar the office manager and one, all senior people.
Right. Now, you referred to Gary Stewart this morning as the person in charge of the health and safety compliance with the CDM regulations. Just a number of questions about that. First, was Gary Stewart a registered architect?
Yes.
He was. And was he a registered health and safety practitioner?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean by that. He was a fully trained architect, and every architect has an obligation to practice responsibly under the health and safety regulations.
Yes, but was he actually registered, though, as a health and safety practitioner?
No.
No.
Not to my, no.
Did Mr. Stewart have any specific training or education on health and safety issues which would equip him to discharge his duty as a health and safety practitioner?
He personally would not have, but we had an organisation supporting us, Krona, who were consultants, and they, in that period, actually carried out a review of our health and safety procedures.
I see. Could you spell their name for me, please?
CRONER.
CRONER. And you say they did a review of your health and safety procedures. When was that, please?
During 2013.
2013. And was there a report?
Yes.
A written report, I should say.
There was a written report.
There was a written report, was there? And who did that written report go to within Studio E? Do you remember?
It went to all the board members and I think all the associates and probably even the senior architects.
I see. And you read it, do you, I assume?
Yes.
Okay. And did it give you a clean bill of health, or were there criticisms in it?
It wasn't that type of report. They were actually taking a review for an upgrade of our systems, and I remember that there was a bit of frustration because we felt that whereas it was actually fairly strong on the sort of admin office side of things, it was perhaps less helpful on the project side.
And did Krona have specific construction and design expertise in health
yes.
in the health
Yes,
and
they
safety
did.
sense? They did. Right. We may come back to revisit that in due course if we need to. Can I move on in time from where we were in the emails which we were looking at before? There was a meeting on the 9th of December 2011 with RBKC, and you cover that in your statement at paragraph 34. If we could have that up on the screen, please. That's SEA 000-14271 at page 9. Paragraph 34. And you say there, on Friday 9th December 2011, I attended a preliminary meeting at RBK's Town Hall with Peter Wright, RBKC, to review potential works to the tower.
Yes.
I prepared an agenda for the meeting. We've seen that.
Yes.
And you go on to say, at the meeting, Peter Wright would have provided an introduction and overview of the RBKC's objectives and reviewed the scope of potential works. Who else attended the meeting, do you remember?
I could not be certain. It may have just been Peter and myself.
Right. And do you remember what RBKC said, if anything, about the objective that they wished to achieve through the works on or around Grenfell Tower?
As I recall it, they were looking to upgrade the tower at the same time as the main calc project was undertaken.
And did you tell RBKC at that meeting that you had concerns about the appearance of Grenfell Tower, which had an effect on the calc project?
You keep asking me this point, and I keep saying that I don't think I was particularly categoric about it. I mean, I could see the benefit of having the tower refurbished if the council were mindful to do it. It wasn't that I was pushing them to actually undertake the project.
Was there any discussion of overcladding Grenfell Tower?
There may have been. There may have been.
Maybe. When you say there may have been, are you saying you can't?
Well, it was on the agenda, so I'd be surprised if it wasn't.
Very good.
I think it had been broached before.
Right. Can I ask you now, please, to be shown SEA 0000, 4 zeros, 3567 at page 2. Now, this is an email from Mark Anderson to you, Mr. Kuszell, on the 29th of February 2012. You see that?
Yes.
And subject, Grenfell Tower adjacent to calc.
Yes.
And he sets out the initial description of the project. Now, Mark Anderson is TMO, isn't he?
Yes.
Had you come across him before this email?
I cannot recall.
Okay. And he says, "Good evening, Andrzej. I understand that Peter has mentioned the generalities of our approach and desire to make use of the services offered by Studio E." And it goes on to say there is a desire, both on the part of RBKC and KCTMO, to enhance Grenfell Tower whilst undertaking the calc project. And then you'll see underneath that he says that the principal objectives of the project are, and there are a number of them, A to I.
Yes.
And the first one is to improve the public realm links around the base of the tower, as provided for in the SPD. What was the SPD?
It was the development plan.
Right. And then at G, you can see to overclad the tower, providing for significant energy efficiency, including the windows.
Yes.
And a number of other things as well. My question about that list, was this the first communication that you or Studio E had with the TMO in respect of the Grenfell Tower project in at all?
I couldn't be absolutely certain, but I think so. This communication, I think, I received when I was on holiday, and I recall that Bruce, at that point, stepped into the discussions with the TMO.
Right. You say you were on holiday. Is that a specific recollection that you have?
Yes, because I'm a skier, so I actually was skiing at that point in time, I think.
Right.
I usually go at that time of year.
I see. Okay. It then says, this work will be separate to but complementing calc. It must not in any way compromise the calc project, and we will require assurances and a clear delineation demonstrating this. What did you understand he meant by assurances?
I think there was a concern both in, initially with Kensington, that they didn't want the calc project to suffer because we were going to dissipate resources on something else. So I think there was a requirement on us to provide people who would be separate to the staff that we were using on calc. And my understanding was also that they would be separate contracts.
Right, I see. Now, going back to the list, A to I, if we can, you can see the first one, or the first two, A and B, are improving public realm, and then B, to rationalise the ground floor arrangements. And then item G, we've just seen, overcladding. when you got this list, did you read this list as ranking items in order of importance?
No.
No. And the email goes on to say, just below the list, 3 paragraphs below it, additionally it says, commissions will be via KCTMO and subject to OJEU or OJEU limits. Do you see that? It's the 3rd paragraph or line
Yes.
below the list.
Yes.
About that, that rather suggests that it was the TMO who wanted to use Studio E as the architect for the Grenfell refurbishment. Is that how you read it?
I think I understood that, notwithstanding the fact that we'd been introduced to this through Kensington, that it would be the KCTMO who would be commissioning us.
And then he goes on to say at the bottom, well, perhaps I should just ask you first before I do, subject to OJEU limits. What were those limits at the time? Do you recall?
I wouldn't be able to quote what the limits would be. I think that's probably a question for KCTMO, but we know that government agencies have to operate within certain limits if they're going to a single entity.
Yes. In fact, I think the limits at that time were £174,000. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, maybe.
And then he goes on to say, just after the 1, 2, 3 stages, we need to rapidly conclude the initial stage and proceed quickly with the project so that we maximise any opportunities that may arise from joint procurement and construction. So did you get the impression from that that time was of the essence, speed was needed?
Yes.
And what did you take by the phrase opportunities that may arise from joint procurement and construction? What opportunities did you understand there were from that?
Well, there were at least 2 significant opportunities. The first would be that by using the same contractor and the same team, in fact, in a way, possibly 3, by using the same contractor and the same team that had already been pre-selected for the CALC project, that it would actually be a more straightforward procedure for appointing that same team to do the tower. Second was that there could be commercial advantages of having a team that's already in harness, so to speak, and particularly the contractor being on site, that it might actually reduce cost. And thirdly, because the team and the contractor were already operational, this would permit both the tower and the CALC project to be completed at the same time.
So cheap, convenient, quick, even though Grenfell Tower was a completely different kind of project with different challenges.
As it proved, it wasn't cheap because the contractor priced higher than the budget. Convenient, yes, and I could see why the borough would wish to see the whole project completed in its entirety, more or less at the same time.
Okay. Now, is it right that Mark Anderson of the TMO made... Well, let me ask it differently. Did Mark Anderson of the TMO ever make any inquiries, to your knowledge, of Studio E's relevant skills, knowledge and experience in overcladding residential high-rise buildings, existing residential high-rise buildings?
I don't recall that as a direct question, no.
What about as an indirect question?
There was a comment made by somebody in the borough when we were designing a residential part to the CALC development. It was something like 30 units at the far end next to the leisure centre, and we were getting a bit of stick for the design. And somebody, and I can't warrant who, made a comment that Studio E aren't exactly residential architects. So I mean that's kind of a very indirect comment. That's the only one I can really recall in the sense that you are suggesting.
Was that comment made to you?
It was made in a. I don't think it may have been made at planning committee or in a large consultation, but
Did you respond to it?
I don't think it was made to me.
Right. Okay. Now, the process of appointment of Studio E to the Grenfell Tower project was rather different from Calc. And let me, or perhaps I can ask you this way. Did the process of appointment of Studio E to the Grenfell Tower project require you to have any relevant skills, knowledge and experience of overcladding an existing high-rise residential tower block?
No.
Did the process of appointment to the Grenfell Tower project involve any competitive procurement, so far as Studio E was concerned?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did it involve an interview?
Not in the sense that I think you mean.
In a procurement sense?
No, we weren't involved in the interview.
Was there a design competition?
No.
Was there a competence check done by the TMO on Studio E?
There was a competence check undertaken by Kensington, and how they shared that with KCTMO, I wouldn't be able to answer.
When I say competence check, I mean competence check for the Grenfell Tower project as opposed to the Calc project.
No, I appreciate what you're asking, but they were effectively in discussions with Kensington to take the whole team, contractor and all designers as one.
Right. As far as you recall, Mr. Kuszell, what was the competence check that RBKC did of Studio E in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
Oh, specifically at Grenfell Tower, I think that, first of all, if I can answer this in sequence, for the Calc project, I would struggle to recall exactly what they asked, but I do know that they would have checked our competence. When it comes to how that might have been transferred from Kensington to KCTMO, I think I'm probably not in the best position to answer that. It may be that my colleague Bruce Sounes, who actually took over the negotiations at that point in time, may be able to add something to this, but I can't.
Right, well, let's ask it one more time so that I'm clear, you're clear about what I'm asking. Do you recall either RBKC or the TMO ever doing a competence check of Studio E for the Grenfell Tower project?
In my recollection, I cannot recall, but that doesn't mean that they didn't.
Okay. So does that mean that you're not able to help me answer the question whether either RBKC or TMO ever investigated Studio E's expertise, experience and suitability for the Grenfell Tower project?
I'm saying that at that point in time when that might have happened, I was not in the forefront of these discussions. I do not recall.
Slightly different question, but similar format. Did anybody, TMO or RBKC, ever ask or investigate whether Studio E was appropriately qualified and resourced from a CDM point of view to carry out the Grenfell project?
Again, it falls into the same category as the previous question and answer.
Right. And going back to, if I can, the email we looked at a minute ago, which is still on the screen. It should be still on the screen. I asked you about the sentence that says that we need assurances. This is just after the list. If you could just go back to that. It's,
yes.
You can see that there. This work will be separate to, but complementing Calc. You, I think, were required, I think you told me this earlier, to ensure that you didn't divert resources away from the Calc project.
Correct.
Yes. Did you understand that that meant that the Grenfell project was in some way a lower priority than Calc? No.
Not at all.
Was it a lower priority for Studio E than
No,
the Calc project?
Not at all.
What was the size of the Calc team within Studio E as at 2012?
In all honesty, I think that it would be very difficult for me to answer that with any certainty because the team varied in size depending on the stage it was at. But I would have expected maybe 8 people on the project.
On calc?
Yeah. On the academy, more specifically, because there was another firm of architects working on the leisure centre.
Right. So would that be 8 out of 9? Or 8 out of...
Did you say 12 or did you say...
In 2012?
2012.
8 out of how many? Let me ask it that way.
Oh, gosh. I mean, we were a practice of 40-odd at that point in time. So in terms of deploying resources, if that's where the question is leading, is that where you're going with this question?
I just would want to know numbers. I'm trying to get a sense of the proportion of staff, architects that you put on the calc project in comparison with the proportion of architects that you put on the Grenfell Tower project. Do you see? I'm just trying to get a feel for for what those numbers are.
The problem with your question is that it generalizes, and the numbers of staff who work on a project vary through the different stages. So it's much lower at the beginning, and it peaks when you're doing the detailed technical information.
Yes.
Calc was, shall we say, out of sequence with Grenfell, because Grenfell got going much later than calc. And so, whereas the team on calc would have been peaking in the second half of 2012, Grenfell was still actually at a very sort of interim planning stage,
Yeah.
which was which meant that I think Bruce Sounes should answer the question specifically how many people were working on Grenfell, because I would not wish to hazard a guess, but it was definitely the appropriate number to do the project.
What are RIBA stage? You know what I mean when I talk about RIBA
Yes, of course I
stages.
do.
What are RIBA stage would you normally see a peak for requirement of architects?
Stroke EF.
EF. Okay. And at what stage, or rather when, was the EF stage for calc? Or your part in calc?
It was in the second half of 2012.
And when was the EF stage for the Grenfell Tower project?
We didn't get to E until the very end of 2013.
You helped us earlier on about the procurement process that had been run for the calc project and for the Grenfell Tower project. Do you accept that had a competitive procurement process been run for the Grenfell Tower project for architectural services, it's unlikely that Studio E would have qualified, given the absence of any high-rise residential refurbishment experience?
I think that knowing the way procurement works with local authorities, I think you're right.
Now, we looked at the OGAU limit a minute ago. It's referred to in this letter or email in passing, on the footing that it was £174,000 at the time. Take that from me. Would that mean that the estimated value of Studio E's contract for architectural services with the TMO would have to be less than £174,000?
The answer is yes, but the precise figures that we're operating at the time, again, I would much prefer that Bruce answered the question rather than me, because he was much closer to it.
Well, we will certainly do that. Did you understand at the time, and this is late 2012 I'm talking about, that the fees for Studio E had in essence been capped at the OJEU limit of £174,000?
I knew there was a cap.
You knew there was a cap. You didn't know how much.
I know there was a figure being quoted, and I can't. You've mentioned 174,000, and I cannot remember the figure, but I do remember, and I think there's correspondence in my evidence that actually between myself and Bruce, indicating that the fee was low for what we were being asked to do.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that, I think. Did you form the view at the time that KCTMO was trying to avoid a competitive procurement process by keeping your fees below the £174,000 cap?
It was certainly, my understanding, it was a method to permit them to appoint not just us but others as well. to carry out the work prior to being novated to the contractor under the selection process that had been employed for the contractor using the IEASY framework.
Now, at this stage, do you remember that the TMO was planning to use the same design and build contractor for Grenfell that it was using on the Calc project?
Yes.
Leadbitter, yes?
Correct.
Yes. Do you remember, why was that?
It was for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier. I gave you the three reasons.
Right, it's those three reasons, is it? Okay. Now, we know that Bruce Sounes emailed you the same day, 29th of February 2012. If we could please have up on the screen SEA 00003567, page 1. And here it is, email from him to you at 2020. Andrzej, not sure if you've received all of the below. Concerned about the emphasis of working at risk while planning to OJEU it all doesn't add up. You see that?
Yes.
Just pausing there. Was he concerned? Sorry, let me ask it differently. Do you remember in your mind whether he was concerned about Studio E not getting paid?
Yes.
And concerned also perhaps about the level of fees, bearing in mind the OJEU limit?
Yes, both.
Both. And he then says in the third paragraph, I feel first I need to acknowledge receipt, ask to meet, then walk the site with him to understand the scope described, probably with Neil. We are a little green on process and technicality, so I propose some rapid CDP, MF being my first point of call. I will hold off circulating this until we understand their thinking on consultants. I just want to ask you about that final paragraph. MF, who was that a reference to?
Max Fordham.
Now, they were the building services engineer on the Calc project, weren't they?
Yes.
Why would Max Fordham have been able to assist you, your firm, in obtaining rapid CDP, or CPD?
CPD it should have been.
It should, for the Grenfell project that was being offered.
I believe they had quite some track record of dealing with refurbishment of residential buildings, including towers.
What would you have asked them?
What would I have asked them?
Well, yes. What would you or Studio E have asked them when obtaining CPD from Max Fordham?
Well, I think perhaps the better way to start the answer to this question would be to remark what Bruce actually meant by rapid CPD.
Well, we will ask him about that. I'm asking about your understanding as the recipient of this email. Let me ask a different question. As at the date of this email, late February 2012, did you feel that Studio E really did have the relevant skills, knowledge and experience to provide the architectural services that the Grenfell Tower project demanded?
I believed that we had the processes and experience of complex buildings to be able to undertake this commission, and it wasn't just my belief, it was clearly the belief of all senior members in my practice. But it was clear that there would be a need for CPD and research around the project to actually establish what the different issues around this project might be. So coming back to your question on Max Fordham's, the practice always took the holistic view of how we approached our design work. So our belief was always to assemble a team from the earliest briefing stage on a project, because we believed that all members of a team have something to contribute even at those early stages. So Max Fordham, who are a firm we've worked with a huge amount, very successfully on lots and lots of projects, knowing that they had a track record in residential, it wasn't unreasonable for Bruce at the time to email me and say, I will start Max Fordham's, because he had very good connections with them, and it wouldn't have been uniquely just going to them, but they would have been an obvious member to start with.
Did you consider when you got this email, or indeed at any time after that, whether under the, or in accordance with the CDM regulations, 2007 as they existed then, Studio E was competent and adequately resourced to address the health and safety issues likely to be involved on the Grenfell Tower project?
I don't think I had a reason to doubt that we would be able to do it. I think if something had arisen as we progressed, then we would have reviewed it. But the practice was doing complex projects, and I've already answered the question that in many instances, some of those complex projects would have been first-time projects.
Given that Mr. Sounes is saying that you're a little green on process and technicality, my question is, why didn't you have reason to doubt it, namely the ability to be competent and adequately resourced to address the health and safety issues that would arise?
I think if I understand your question, you're saying, did we think that we could actually accumulate the knowledge to do the project properly, as we have done on past complex projects, and there was no reason to doubt that we couldn't do it.
Did you give any specific, you say you had no reason to doubt it, but did you actually give any specific consideration to that question at the time?
Well, at the time when I received the email, as I've already said, I was actually on holiday, but I knew that we had put the project in the hands of one of our most senior and experienced people, technically very sound, and I had no reason to believe that he wasn't going to do what he was saying he was going to do, notably to start researching the project.
So does it come to this, Mr. Kuszell, that you didn't actually think about it specifically at the time, you just didn't have any reason to think that your firm wouldn't be competent and adequately resourced to address the relevant health and safety issues that would arise?
I had no reason to believe that we wouldn't be able to do it.
Right. Now, we know from Mr. Sounes' statement, his witness statement to the inquiry, that when in this email he said, we are a little green on process and technicality, so I propose some rapid CDP or CPD, he was referring to Studio E's lack of experience in residential high-rise overcladding projects. Now, he'll be asked about that, but for the transcript, rather than for your purposes, Mr. Kuszell, it's paragraph 64. I want to ask you about the word rapid. He uses the word rapid in the paragraph we're looking at. Did you sense, when you got this email, that there was some urgency to CDOE getting up to speed on how to overclad a residential tower block?
I think when I got this email, my hunch is that Bruce would have written this email on the hoof, and now you are going back on every single word in the email, and I'm not sure that your interpretation is correct.
Well, how, doing the best you can with your recollection, did you understand the sense of what Mr. Sounes was telling you when he said, I propose some rapid CDP?
I understood it to be exactly what he was saying, which was that he was going to start researching the various issues that surrounded this type of project.
Yeah. I mean, the impression that one might get from this email is that he thought there was some urgency to the matter, and my question is, did you get that impression at the time?
I don't know about how urgent it was. I mean, the project... Typically, projects go through the RABA stages, which you referred to earlier. And so on every project, the first step is actually agreeing the brief. Then there is the outline stage, stage C, where initial ideas are developed, usually rotating around the layout issues of a building and its appearance, and information actually builds up. So yes, there would have been an urgency to get on with the project, and the CPD, I keep looking at the CDP, so sorry, CPD would have been part and parcel of actually moving on the project.
Yeah. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 41 of your statement, please? That's SEA 000-14271 at page 11. Paragraph 41.
41.
Yes, and you are dealing with this email there, and you say, with regard to continuous professional development, CPD, to which I understood Bruce to be referring in this email, we have a CPD policy at Studio E which comprises organised talks, internal presentations, in-house training and site visits. And then you go on at the last, you can look at the rest if you like, but I want to ask you about the last sentence here. You say, given the breadth of work that Studio E had a track record in delivering, the size of the practice, the quality and experience of the architects and designers it employs, I took Bruce's comments as nothing more than prudent recognition of needing to do some project-specific research. Right. What do you mean there in your statement by project-specific research?
Every project we undertake has project-specific research. I mean, even our repeat commissions require project-specific research. So in this case, this being a new project to our practice, there would have been specific legwork to do to actually research the issues that rotated around the project.
And would that have included looking at the regulations which govern the construction of external walls?
It would have included going to initially. It would have included speaking to various parties who've had dealings with a project of this nature, and those discussions would inevitably steer you towards looking at some aspects of the regulations.
It's right, isn't it, as we've seen, that you'd just been approached to design the refurbishment and overcladding of what was an existing residential high-rise tower, yes?
Yep.
And it's right, as you told us earlier, that your practice had never done a commission of that kind before, right?
Yes.
Yes. And you personally, I think, had never done a project like that before.
No.
And I think, am I right in saying Bruce Sounes, the architect who was going to take the lead on the project, had also never done a project like that before?
No.
So on what basis did you think that project-specific research, as you call it, was going to be sufficient?
Well, I think that, first of all, if it hadn't been sufficient, I'm sure that Bruce would have come to me to say, Andrzej, I'm at sea here, I don't know what I'm doing. So I wasn't directly dealing with the project, so I had no reason to believe that the research that would be undertaken was going to lead to any other conclusion than that we could continue with the project.
Do you know what, I'm using your expression, project-specific research Bruce Sounes actually did?
I think I could try to summarize it for you, but it would be at second-hand knowledge, because obviously he did the research, not me, and I think you probably ought to direct the question to him. I know he did it, but I don't want to fall into an error of actually quoting things that he may or may not have done.
Fair enough. But you say, as you just have, I know he did it. What do you know he did? What do you remember him having done?
I know that he was involved in the assisting KCTMO to appoint the whole team, and I know that he was instrumental in getting them to appoint the fire consultant. I know that he would have been speaking to all those consultants, most of whom actually had experience of high-rise residential refurb type work. I know he talked to specialists in the field, cladding contractors who actually had done hundreds of, well, they don't know about hundreds, but certainly many projects in the past.
You say that you know that he talked to specialists in the field, cladding contractors. Do you know who they were?
I think you're asking me to answer questions which I now know at second hand, and I think you should be directing those questions to Bruce.
Well, let me try you, if you don't mind. Do you remember which or who the cladding contractors were that Bruce Sounes spoke to as part of his project-specific research?
I think the way we worked, we were all in one studio, and Bruce would have been closer than the chair here. And so in the general working mode, one would hear all sorts of things. And at the moment, I hope you will appreciate that after 2.5 years of hearing all sorts of information, your memory can start to play tricks as to what you heard or didn't hear at the time. Obviously, I'm familiar with the names that he did consult, but I'm not inclined to be speaking on his behalf as to precisely who he consulted.
No, Mr. Kuszell, it's not a trick question. I just
Well, it
wanted to know
doesn't
whether
feel
you.
right.
I just wanted to know whether you remember any specific names. If you don't remember, you don't remember. We
I
can
really
ask him.
cannot recall
All
because
right.
it's so long ago.
All right.
It would have been in passing. He may have even mentioned it to me, but it would have been a conversation, not a written communication. At least if there was a written communication, I'm not recalling it at this moment in time.
Did you make any checks yourself to see whether Bruce Sounes or indeed anybody else at Studio E actually did carry out any project-specific research? Did you supervise that exercise?
I was aware that the research was being undertaken. I repeat, Bruce was in the same studio as me, and I was aware of the work being undertaken. But he was in charge of the project, and I had every confidence that he was very capable of doing what he was doing.
Did you take any steps to ensure that every member of the team that you were supervising or would come to supervise on the Grenfell Tower project had carried out some research or had done any CPD on, for example, cladding high-rises?
I was aware of people working with Bruce on the project and therefore doing that sort of research, but I wasn't involved in any of the detail, no.
Who can you identify who you were aware of as having carried out that sort of research?
I could only recall people who worked on the project, but whether what they specifically were doing on the project is something you should be asking Bruce.
But from your knowledge, do you know whether anybody who worked on the project themselves carried out any project-specific research about how to overclad a residential high-rise building?
I know now that they were doing it, yes.
Right. And do you know what they were doing, even now?
I think I do, but I repeat that you are asking me questions, having acknowledged that I actually wasn't hands-on the project. So you're asking me to answer things which were not in my direct knowledge. Within a practice of the size that we were at the time, people took control of projects, and you only were looking at things which were drawn to your attention, and that was how the hierarchy worked.
Now, can I ask you, we're moving on in time, can I ask you to look, please, at SEA 0000 14272. This is your statement.
Yep. Yep.
That's one wrong. That's not right. That's not right. That's a wrong reference. If you go to page 2, I'm so sorry. I've given you page 1. I think I need to give you page 2. And we see there an email from you, to you, I'm so sorry, to Bruce Sounes, from you, of Wednesday, the 7th of March, 2012. Bruce, I will give you a call to discuss. Happy for you to front. I seem to remember an OJEU limit of around £175,000, but it may be it has been reduced. £99,000 will be problematic for the services they are proposing. Then you go on to say we should not look at this as a poor relative, but more as an extension of the Commission. I'm sure that RBKC will be looking for something that will complement the calc development. And if you see that, if you go over the page, because there's an email that comes lower down. Oh, no, we missed it. If you go, I can find it. If you go down the page on page 2. If you go down the page on page 2, it's immediately below it. You get the response from Bruce Sounes. Do you see that?
Yes.
Andre, brief update. Met Mark yesterday with Bill, Tony, and someone else from MF. walked around and will have another walk around next week. He thought OGAU limit was £175,000. I did a quick search and found 99,000. And then he goes on to say, it's definitely a project, but a poor relative compared to calc. He mentioned hunters arriving at a figure of £5 to £6 million, which sounds too little. And then he goes on to say, I think you or I need to go back to Mark outlining our take and plan of action and fee estimate. Appleyards was discussed, but only that they are not part of our team and that costings would be needed. Left that with Mark. He's also going to chase what drawings he can find. Very happy to front this, he goes on to say. Might be cleaner and provide a shield for Gary's gripes. Resourcing-wise, I'm not sure. Marcus is maybe not the right person for sketches, massing studies and visuals. Highlight of the walk round was the boxing club, see attached. I've read it all to you because I have a number of detailed questions on the email. You've said in your statement, and we can look at it if we need to, that if the OGAEU limit was £99,000, which it wasn't, then that would be problematic. Do you remember saying that in your statement? I can show it to you if you like. It's paragraph 44.
Yes, I think I recall.
Right. Now, by that, do you mean that £99,000 would not cover all of the design work needed in advance of putting the project out to tender for a design and build contract?
I think that was the inference, yes.
Yes. Did you think that £174,000 would be sufficient to cover that work?
I think we thought it would.
You think, let me just get that right, you think you thought it would. Does
Yeah.
that indicate that there was some indication that you knew that the budget, or thought that the budget for the architectural services would be tight from the outset?
We were worried that as you saw in the previous email, there were two issues. The first was what the budget for the fees would be, and the second was if we did undertake work at risk, if the project was stopped, would we lose out?
Yes. And let me just ask the question again, because I'm not quite sure you...
I don't think we're
No.
understanding each
Let me
other.
put it a slightly different way. Is it fair to say that you thought that the budget for the architectural services that you were being asked to provide for the Grenfell Tower project would be tight?
I think we were worried that the OJU limit that would be imposed on the KCTMO could result in us having to do more work than the fee would cover.
Did that affect your enthusiasm for the project?
No,
Did it affect your decisions on how you would resource the project?
no.
Mr. Sounes says in the second paragraph of the email I've just shown you, hunters arriving at a figure of £5 to £6 million, which he thought was too little. Did you agree?
I think Bruce's comment there is probably a gut reaction to the size of project and the value being put to it. To quantify a figure like that, you would need to put in quite a bit of analysis to be accurate.
Did you have any view about what you thought a reasonable figure might be?
No, at that stage, no. I think this takes us back to what I said earlier, that in a sense, when you develop a project, you can start with a budget and then work out what you want to do, or you could go the other way and work out what you want to do and then try to work out how much it costs. There's always a budget and there's always an ambition, and striking the balance between the two is what actually happened during those early design stages.
Mr. Sounes goes on to say in the next paragraph, or rather the first part of the paragraph we're on, it's definitely a project, but a poor relative compared to calc. Is it fair to say that from the way you understood it, that Mr. Sounes was not particularly enthusiastic, at least at this stage, about the Grenfell Tower project?
I don't think that reflects on Bruce's view of the project. I think it was Bruce's reflection on the budget.
I see. Okay. But in comparison with the win on the Calc project for Studio E, getting Grenfell wasn't much of a win.
I don't think we would see it that way at all. I think this is, I would like to show some respect to the people who suffered in this tragedy in answering this question. For us, it was an important project.
All right. Now, you then go on to say...
Sorry, I wonder if you could scroll up, Mr. Millett, because the reference to being a poor relative was touched on further up the
Yes,
page.
I responded to that.
And this is the message to which I think Mr. Kuszell then responded.
Yes.
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 So-
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Well, let's look at it now, since the chairman has raised it. You say in your response, we shouldn't look at this as a poor relative, but more as an extension of the Commission. So is that right? That in fact you saw the Grenfell Tower project as really as an add-on to the Calc Commission?
No, I wish you would stop using, sorry to say this, but such negative language. We were very, very proud to win the Calc Commission. I know that area of Kensington. I've never lived there, but I know it very well. And we could see that this project was going to make a huge difference to that part of Kensington, which always looks at itself as a poor neighbour to the south. And it included not just the buildings, but a lot of public realm, which was being reinvented. And our ambition was to make it as good as it possibly could be within the budgets that were being specified by the client. And I have to say that the tower fitted that absolutely. Our ambition was to actually do the best possible job on the tower. And that's why I wrote what I wrote, because it was an absolute firm belief that we were doing a scheme which actually in its entirety would lift the area.
Yeah. Now, when I use the word add-on, which I think you seem to have taken exception to,
Because it makes it sound like a poor relative, and I'm afraid I see it as a whole.
thank you very much. I just wanted to get your evidence about what you mean as an extension of the Commission. The Commission, let me ask you, the Commission you're talking about in this email was what?
The original commission was to redesign the leisure centre, design a new academy, provide some additional residential, and also to reappoint a huge area of space that surrounded these buildings and adjoined Grenfell.
Yeah. Now, can I ask you to go back, please, to the email we were looking at from Bruce Sounes to you, to which you were responding. In the penultimate paragraph, he says, very happy to front this, might be cleaner and provide a shield for Gary's gripes. Who is Gary? Is that Gary Stewart?
Yes.
What were Gary's gripes at that time? Do you remember? This is early 2012.
I think it would be better for you to ask Bruce exactly what he meant by Gary's gripes. But there was some friction in the practice, and it may be that Bruce was referring to that. But right. I think, in all honesty, he wrote it. Right. You ask him.
Now, we can ask him about that. My question was directed to what you understood by it.
Well, I think I've just given you the answer, that there were frictions in the practice. When you're a practice of 40-odd people, you begin to get, sometimes it's a sort of normal part of organisation.
I'm sorry to press you. You received this expression, Gary's gripes. You didn't. Did you understand what he meant?
Looking back on it specifically, because you're trying to pin me down on something which he wrote to me 8 years ago, and I cannot really recall specifically what he had in mind, other than what I've already answered.
Right. Now, in terms of staffing, if you look at the last line of Mr. Sounes' email, he says, just after the reference to Gary's gripes, resourcing-wise, I'm not sure. Marcus is maybe not the right person for sketches, massing studies, and visuals. The Marcus referred to, is that Marcus Kiefer?
Correct.
Why was Marcus Kiefer not the right person? for those things? Sketches, massing studies, and visuals.
I think this is to do with, again, I think it would be better if you asked Bruce this question as well, but my understanding of it would have been that Marcus was not so versatile in some of the 3D CAD work that one might employ to do early design studies.
Right. Moving on, can I ask you please to go to LBI 00000129. Now, these are minutes of the residence forum for the Calc project.
Yes.
Held in the EMB Hall on the 28th of March 2012. And we can see from the list of attendees that you were there
Yes.
for Studio E. You see that?
Yes.
And we can also see a number of other attendees, including Laura Johnson, the head of housing, Mark Anderson from the TMO, if we look just above your name, Mr. Kuszell. And then in the middle of the list, we see Edward Defan. Do you see that?
In the middle, Edward Defan. Yes.
Yes. And do you remember that he was a resident of the tower at the
Yes,
time?
I do.
Now, if you go to the bottom of page 1 of this document, this minute, you can see that there was item 3, Introduction to Architects. Do you see that?
Yes.
And at the very bottom, in the last bullet point on that page, and indeed over onto the next page, you can see that you did a presentation of the meeting, of the project, the scheme. Do you see that?
Yes.
And was that the Grenfell Tower scheme or the Calc scheme?
It would have been the Calc scheme.
It was the Calc scheme. It looks like the Calc scheme because Grenfell Tower, in fact, as we look later on, is covered under any other business at the end of the meeting.
Yep.
And if you want just to look at that very quickly, if you go to page 2, at the very bottom of page 2, if you could be shown that, at 9 AOB Grenfell Tower.
Yep.
And there are some questions and discussion about that, which we'll come to in a moment. I'll come back to that. When you go to your presentation, which we see at the bottom of page 1, if we can return to that, please, you are recorded as having explained the scheme. That's, you say, the Calc scheme. Did you cover Studio E's experience in this presentation? Do you remember?
Not that I can remember. I can barely, I mean, if you hadn't shown me the note, I wouldn't have remembered specifically this meeting. But, so no, I can't remember.
Now, looking, still on page 1, item 3, Introduction to Architects, you can see that in the second bullet point, ED, that's Edward Defan, says, or is recorded as saying, concerns were raised about input of community into design process.
Yes.
Can you remember Mr. Defan saying something about concerns in that respect?
I can remember Eddie very well because he was an outspoken member of the tower, and I think he was concerned about the level of consultation that will be undertaken by the borough in doing the development.
Do you remember him making that point at this meeting?
At this meeting, no.
Okay. Do you remember having any concerns that the community, as this note suggests, wasn't having input into the design process?
Our instructions on the project were to only engage with the community as and when the borough wished us to do it. And
did they ever to the best of your recollection?
Yeah, there were community exhibitions, and there were these engagements which were held at the base of the tower. There was a small conference room, and those meetings were always chaired by the borough. As far as Calc is concerned, I'm not now going into Grenfell. As far as the Calc was concerned, they were chaired by the borough, and they were managed by the borough.
Yeah. And going back to the note, do you remember, this is a context question, do you remember whether, as this note again suggests, Mr. Defarn's concerns, or Mr. Defan was talking about concerns being raised about community input in respect of the Calc project?
Yes.
Yes. Going to the bottom of page 2, if we can, please, AOB, Grenfell Tower, and then over onto page 3, you'll see that on page 3, the note says ED, that's Edward Defan again, questioned why Studio E chosen to do initial work. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you have a recollection of Mr. Defan raising that question at this meeting?
No. I'm not saying he didn't, but I don't remember it.
We can see just below the bullet point where he's recorded of us as having asked that question. Councillor Coleridge, that is, C-L-L-R-C, Councillor Coleridge, responds and says, very difficult, or is recorded as saying, very difficult to have different contractors on site when times 2 different projects going on, synergises across projects, design, need between school, leisure centre, public realm and Grenfell Tower. Do you remember Councillor Coleridge saying something like that at this meeting?
Not specifically at this meeting, but I do know that expressed the sentiment that I was aware of on behalf of the council.
Very good. Do you remember whether Mr. Defan was satisfied with Councillor Coleridge's response?
I fear that I don't even remember him asking the question. Giving the answer, let alone remembering the question. I'm sorry, but I cannot recall.
Do you remember ever answering yourself Mr. Defan's question, why was Studio E chosen to do initial work?
I don't remember.
Did you ever advise the TMO of Studio E's lack of experience in that kind of project, the Grenfell Tower project, as it was proposed at that stage?
I think that I was aware that they knew exactly what our skill set was. So I had absolutely no doubt that they understood the nature of the work that characterised Studio E.
Now, did you know at this stage, and we're still very early on, that the Grenfell Tower project was going to be a design and build project?
No. Actually, sorry, let's correct that. Our understanding was that the intention for the council and TMO was to actually employ the established contractor for the Calc project. The way that the design project team was selected and the way the contractor was selected were two different things. The contractor was selected under an IESE framework, independently of the design team. The design team on Calc had been pre-selected via the OJU process. So we were basically a selected contractor through IESE and the design team. The intention of, and indeed what the borough did was that as soon as Calc got planning approval, the team was novated to the contractor. So effectively, from that point on, the contractor was taking full responsibility for all the design work, even the design work which preceded. And in effect, it became, from that point, a design and build contract, because he was actually undertaking the completion of the design and doing the build. And the intention at the outset on TMO, as I understand it, was that it would follow the same path. So they would take the contractor and the design team. The design team would work up designs and be novated to the contractor. And it would have still been a design and build.
So at this stage, this is late March 2012, to the best of your recollection, was the idea that at that stage Leadbitter would come in and be the design and build contractor on the Grenfell Tower?
Yes, and
Project,
and I
part
think
of the
that
project.
it became clear as, I mean, again, I think that I'm now speaking a little bit out of turn because Bruce was in the forefront of all these discussions of appointment and how things would happen. So I think you'll need to re-ask the same questions of Bruce, but my understanding was that their intention was to get the team to get it to planning and then to novate to Leadbitter.
I see. Do you remember whether Leadbitter had any experience of its own in the design and build of a cladding project,
No, I don't-
overcladding
I
project
don't
on a
recall-
high-rise building?
I don't recall what the... I mean, they're... I'd be very surprised if they hadn't, because they are a massive contractor. Well, sorry, let's take a step back. Leadbitter, no sooner had they become successful, were taken over by Bouygues. And Bouygues is a huge concern, multinational company. So, you know, I don't doubt they would have had experience in this field. But it's not. I can't speak on their behalf.
I mean, is it fair to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it fair to say that you didn't investigate yourself at this stage whether
No.
Leadbitter would put a cladding specialist onto the design and build part
No.
when they got the deal, when they got the project?
Not to say that Bruce might have asked the questions, but
You didn't.
certainly I didn't.
All right. Can I turn to a different topic, which is the selection of your team? In general terms, Mr. Kuszell, how would architects within Studio E normally be allocated to projects?
It would relate to their ability, experience, availability.
And would an architect normally work on one project at a time or more than one project at a time?
More than one project at a time.
And how would they be expected to balance?
Well, actually,
their-
sorry, can I take a step back on that?
of course.
Because you used just the general term architect. I think architects within a team might find themselves actually working solely on one project. Not always, but because projects stop and start. But more often than not, they are much more on the thing. Whereas by the time you get to an associate or a director, then you'd be working across more than one project.
What about the support staff and assistants?
Well, that's what I mentioned earlier on, the architects who would be working within the team, not senior architects or project architects or even associates.
Now, we know that Bruce Sounes offered to head up the project in his email to you, we looked at earlier. I will happy to front this. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you've told us that he didn't have any personal experience of overcladding an occupied residential high-rise building.
Correct.
Is it right that, and again, you tell me, that the only Studio E staff member, I use the word employee if you like, who had any experience of a project similar to Grenfell Tower was Neil Crawford?
To my knowledge, yes.
And it's, yes, and I think it's, and you say this yourself in your statement, he didn't join the Grenfell Tower project until July 2014.
Correct.
So would I be right in thinking, and again, please correct me if this isn't right, that until Neil Crawford joined the Grenfell Tower project in July 2014, the team of professional architects on the Grenfell Tower project was not experienced in overcladding a residential tower block?
The team working directly on the project, that's correct. But Neil, again, I would ask Bruce to answer that because we were all in one studio. And if I recall an earlier piece of correspondence that you had on the screen, you know, Bruce was even suggesting, and I don't know whether that happened, taking Neil to walk around the site when the inquiry first came our way. So there would have been dialogue within the studio. Bruce Neil and I were working very, very closely together as a team. So even though we were on other projects, there was a lot of dialogue.
I see. Did Studio E have a designated person to carry out a code evaluation before design work started on this project?
Code evaluation is something, it's a terminology I think that's come from the States. I mean, it's more to do with building regs evaluation, and we would evaluate the project at the different stages of development. And particularly critical are the stage reports that we put together as we go through each stage.
Right. So do I take it from that as a practice, at particular RIBA stages, somebody, maybe the person in charge of the project, would check to make sure that the stage at which the project had reached was compliant with, for example, the building regulations?
Well, I think that each party that is involved in the project has to take some responsibility for their spectrum of work. So one of the important factors in the way a project develops is that stage report, because it has many contributors. So, typically you would have had sections written by obviously us, but also by Max Fordhams and Curtains and Exova and maybe others.
Were you involved in selecting the team that would work on the Grenfell Tower project?
Within our office?
Yes. So
I
of
was
course.
involved in selecting Bruce as the lead. And once Bruce was selected, as you can see from the correspondence, there was discussion as to which members of staff should actually back him up at the different stages.
Right. Now, can I ask you to look, please, then, at paragraph 23 of your statement. That's SEA 000142271 at page 6. It's paragraph 23. And you say there that this is under the rubric resourcing and supervision in the middle part of the paragraph. A commission with approximately £1 million construction value and above would have a director or associate director and project architect allocated to it. You see that?
Yes.
What was Bruce Sounes' job title at the start of the Grenfell Tower project?
He was an associate.
And indeed, he in fact describes himself as an associate of Studio E. Is that the same as a director or an associate director?
It's an anomaly, I think. It was used in the statements, but basically, Bruce was an associate. There were discussions about him becoming a director, but he was an associate.
Right. Can you explain why, given the size of the Grenfell Tower project, which on any view was going to exceed £1 million in construction value, you decided to put Bruce Sounes on it, given that he wasn't a director or an associate director?
At the time, there were 3 directors or 3 partners in the practice, and 4 associates, and it was not unusual for an associate to be leading a project on behalf of the practice.
Yes, you see in your statement, you say what you say. A commission with approximately £1 million construction value and above would have a director or associate director and a project architect allocated to it. You now, I think, tell us that it wasn't unusual for an associate to be leading a project. Can we see if we can work out how those two fit together? Given the size of this project, was it unusual to put someone who wasn't a director or associate director on it?
It wasn't unusual, and can we just clarify that associate director, we didn't have an associate director, we had associates. So there were directors, or in fact, at the time when the project was moving forward, we didn't even have directors, we had partners.
Yeah, can we just clarify this? At the time, we're talking about practice being run through an LLP, is that right?
Yes,
Which
so
is a
there were partners.
limited liability partnership.
Correct,
And so there were partners,
correct,
and you've just described Mr. Sounes as being an associate,
correct,
which is presumably a recognised status but not a partner.
correct.
So director isn't a very helpful description.
No, it's not. I'm sorry. I apologise for the
No, that's all right.
inaccuracy
Just
in the
that
statement.
we understand it clearly, that's all.
Yeah.
Right.
So just going back to your statement, at the time, where you say a commission with an approximately £1 million construction value and above would have a director or associate director and a project architect allocated to it, what level or status within Studio E LLP are you talking about? Partners or someone lower than a partner?
I think because this is written, just to explain, first of all, why the anomaly may have arisen, clearly because we're dealing with two entities, Studio E LLP and Studio E Architects Limited. I think what's crept in here is the wrong term for the timing that we're describing. So there were partners and not directors, and there were associates. And what it's saying is basically that above a commission of £1 million or above, we would normally have either a director or an associate and a project architect allocated.
I think you mean a partner or an associate.
Partner or associate.
I see.
And a project architect.
Now, who was the project architect on the Grenfell Tower project?
It changed. Initially, in the first knockings, it would have been Bruce on his own, actually doing some legwork and research, but very rapidly, I think he was joined by Marcus Kiefer. And thereafter, I think really you need to speak to Bruce as to exactly what the staff allocations were, because the project it was unfortunately a sort of stop-start project, so that we got going and then it stopped, and there were planning applications submitted and they had to be resubmitted. So through that period, there would have been a variety of people working at the different stages. We gave a list of all the people who were involved in the project with some shape or form. It's quite considerable.
At the outset of the Grenfell Tower project, who was the... we've talked about Bruce Sounes being the associate. Was he also the project architect allocated to it? Or are you saying that Marcus Kiefer was the project architect at that time?
At that early stage, Bruce Sounes would have been effectively associate and project architect because he was driving the project and he would have had senior architects to help him in the process.
I see. Now, we do know, as you've told us, and indeed you say in your statement, that you assigned Marcus Kiefer to the project. Why did you do that, given that Mr. Sounes had told you that Marcus Kiefer wasn't the right person for the job, as we saw in the email exchange earlier?
Do you know, you're asking me a question which I really cannot recall what happened next and who in the end was deployed one way or another. One thing for sure is that Bruce had the assistance that he needed, and if he had a problem with assembling the people he required, he would have come to me. And there's no correspondence that I can actually refer to that would remind me at the time of what exactly we were doing.
Right. I mean, given that the project, as Mr. Sounes had, I think, indicated to you in the email we saw earlier, was at least £5 to £6 million and probably more, what thoughts did you have about the size of team that you needed to put on it?
I didn't have any concerns about the size of the team. We had people coming free from other projects, and a project doesn't immediately attract a large team. I think, as I've said earlier, the peak of a team is at stage E/F. At the very early stages of a project, you might not have more than 2 people working on the project.
Can we go to an email rather later on, SEA 00008352 at page 1. This is an email of the 6th of September 2013, so we've come forward in time a long way, or back in time a long way, to September 13, and it's an email from Mr. Sounes to you, Mr. Kuszell, about 4 lines down from the start, or actually it's the end of the email, after, I think, talking about other projects. It says, Grenfell Stage E is quite a lot of fee to earn in a short period. I'm a little anxious about the resource. Do you remember receiving that email?
Well, yes, I mean, I remember seeing the email once we assembled all our documentation.
Yes, indeed. And if you go to your witness statement, it's SEA 000-14271 at page 19. I'd like to show you paragraph 67. Page 19, 67. And you say there, at the start of September 2013, Studio E was beginning to enter the RIBA stage E of its work on the project. Bruce was concerned about the amount of work we would have to do, and we started to involve other employees in the project, including Thomas Reck. You see that?
Yes.
So that was your was that your response to his anxieties as he expressed about the resource?
Yes, I mean, he was doing what I would expect him to do, which is to say that we were given a relatively short period of time to prepare the Stage E, and he needed more resource.
And Thomas Reck, I think, was involved between September 2013 and December 2013.
Yes.
Was he a relatively junior team member or employee?
He wasn't the most senior but he was. He had a few years of experience behind him, and he was a very intelligent fellow. But I have to say that again, I would prefer that Bruce spoke about him, because he didn't work directly to me, and I'm probably repeating what I've heard from others rather than actually my own experience.
Did you allocate anybody else to the project at this stage?
I think there were other people working on the project.
In response to Mr. Sounes' expressed anxieties?
Yes. Yes.
Who was that?
I think I'd need to go back on files to check who exactly it was. But if the intention of that question is to suggest that we're under-resourced, I think that is not correct.
Just a few more questions, Mr. Chairman, before the break, if that's convenient.
Yes, right.
Mr. Reck says that he was made redundant from Studio E LLP in December 2013. Is that correct?
I think if he said that, then it must be correct.
Do you remember whether that was due to Studio E's or Studio E LLP's insolvency, or at least the financial difficulties it was experiencing?
We had there was a downturn on a large amount of work which had nothing to do with this project, and so he was made redundant at the end of that year, I believe, because if you'd asked me the question when he was made redundant, I wouldn't have been able to recall that. We made a number of redundancies at the end of the year.
I was going to ask you how many other staff were made redundant.
If you want the numbers, I would have to go back on our records.
Okay. Did the redundancies affect the resourcing on, or available resourcing on the Grenfell Tower project?
No. What affected the resourcing on the Grenfell Tower was the stop-start, because it actually, we maintained continuity with Bruce, but people changed, because if you go on your records, you'll find that planning didn't go in until the end of, we didn't get planning until the beginning of 2014, 2 years after we started the project. And there was a hiatus on the project, which is never good news for us as consultants.
I understand. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment? I'm going to move on.
Yes, you're going to something else, are you?
A different document.
Well, now, Mr. Kuszell, we're going to have a break now so we can all get some lunch. We'll resume at 2:05 and ask you to be ready promptly then.
Yep.
But for now, if you'd like to go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you.
And please Don't talk to anyone about your evidence or any of the subject matter that you're being asked about.
Yeah,
All right?
thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. 2:05, please.